Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White. Welcome to the Myth Salon. Well, here we are again, embroiled in a bit of a controversy. For a long time, it was COVID, and that's all we had was COVID, COVID, COVID. As the pandemic was heating up, we've almost reached 1 million deaths in America, and it's a sad, sad situation. But along comes the crisis in the Ukraine, and I think everybody's attention is riveted on this, and it has such global implications. I want to tell you that for the last 3 Tuesday mornings, Will and I have been gathering with 3 other people, and one of the members of the Ukrainian parliament. And this is a rare opportunity to really feel exactly what it's like on the ground as this thing is heating up. And Will tell you more about it at the end of all of this, and we'll direct you to the website where we have it. So I also want to put out a get well to Charles Zeltzer. He's done his own Myth Salon here when we were doing it in our home with the Mutus Liber, and he's a beautiful, sensitive, wonderful individual. I love him. I also would like to say hello to Dennis Slattery, who would normally be here as one of our panelists, but he's having his 54th wedding anniversary with Sandy tonight, and there is Dyane. We were wondering about you, Dyane. Hello. She's on Central Time tonight. You know, we started earlier in the West. That's a joke. So to get things rolling tonight, you know, I would like to open up with a poem called Resistance by Simon Armitage, written about a week ago. He's a British poet, their poet laureate. It's war again. A family carries its family out of a pranged house under a burning thatch. The scene smacks of archived newsreel, platforms and trains. Never again, never again. Toddlers passed over heads and shoulders, lifetimes stowed in luggage racks. It's war again. Unmistakable smoke on the near horizon, mistaken for thick fog, fingers crossed. An old blue tractor tows an armored tank into no man's land. It's the ceasefire hour. Godspeed the columns of winter coats and fur-lined hoods, the high wire walk over buckled bridges, managing cases and bags, balancing west and east. Godspeed, it's war again. The woman in black gives sunflower seeds to the soldier, insists his marrow will nourish the national flower. In dreams, let bullets be birds. Let cluster bombs burst into flocks. False news is news with the pity edited out. It's war again. An air raid siren cannot fully mute the cathedral bells. Let's call that hope. So tonight, we're really, really pleased to have Gus Cwik and Carolyn Bates with us tonight as the first of a 2-part series. Let me go through my introductions. I'm Dana White. I'm the co-founder of the Myth Salon and a contributing member of Pacifica's Myth program. My partner in the Myth Salon since its inception 5 years ago is Dr. Linn, who is coming tonight from I thought it was Alabama, but he says he's in Georgia. So he's running around on the East Coast. And he's the founder of the mythhouse.org website, and he chairs the general education department at Hushin College, where he teaches myth to storytellers. Dr. Dyane Sherwood, let's see here. Dyane co-authored the book with the late analyst Joseph L. Henderson that relates a series of alchemical illuminations to the process of depth transformation. It's called Transformation of the Psyche, the symbolic alchemy of the splendor soulless. She has published on a wide range of topics and serves as a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. She is a certified Jungian psychoanalyst, a child and adolescent analyst, and a teaching member of the Sandplay Therapists of America. Susan Clements Negley is a Jungian analyst in private practice in San Antonio. This is where it gets interesting. A graduate of the Cordon Bleu cooking school in Paris. We need more members like this in our community. She launched her career as a professional chef. Her diploma thesis was the Conjunctio Gastronomique, a study in the process of individuation in culinary terms. We should all be so fortunate. It charts the mythic and alchemical underpinnings of the journey from a professional kitchen to the symbolic kitchen, the psyche. And it sounds like we should have you do your own Myth Salon, Susan. She's the training coordinator for the Texas seminar of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. She gives lectures on the Alchemical kitchen, as well as her newest project on the persona. Dr. Carolyn Bates is a psychologist and a Jungian analyst also in Austin. She currently serves as the president of the Texas Seminary of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts Training Institute. And over the last 3 decades, she has offered workshops and lectures on ethics and boundary violations, technology's influence within the collective, the symbolism of pilgrimage, the feminine archetype in dreams and fairy tales, and the phenomenon of synchronicity and trauma in the collective. She has published on the influence of cultural and political events on the analytical container, and she recently set aside an avid motorcycling passion for the more grounded practice of permaculture gardening, but continues to support motorcycle safety and awareness with a keen appreciation for the archetypal nature of the mechanical horse. And our featured presenter tonight is Dr. Gus Cwik. He's a clinical psychologist, hypnotherapist, and a Jungian analyst in private practice in the Chicago area. He's a member of the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts and the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. He is also on the editorial board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and he was the co-director of training of the Analyst Training Program and co-director of the Clinical Training Program in Analytical Psychotherapy at the Jung Institute in Chicago. He has published articles on thirdness, the structure of analysis, alchemy, supervision, dreams, and active imagination. So, after all of those words, what I would like to do is welcome us tonight into the Myth Salon with a moment of silence. So, if you bear with me just one moment. And to all of the people who are experiencing challenges here, at home, and abroad, in the Ukraine, wherever they happen to be, I hope healing crosses their paths. So with that, let me turn it over now to our good friend, Gus Cwik. Thank you very much, Gus.
Thank you, Dana. Let me just get to the slides here. This presentation with my good friend and colleague, Carolyn Bates, we first presented this at an interregional conference in 2019 on kind of the turbulent times. I guess we just don't leave them sort of behind, as Dana talked about. Want to remind people that it is in 2 parts, and in 2 weeks, we'll have the second part of the presentation, which is a dialogue of the archetypes. Today, we're focusing, and for people new to alchemy, in terms of the Rosarium Philosophorum, a sort of alchemical series very close to my heart. I've spent the bulk, been a Jungian analyst for 31 years now. This is the series that grabbed me. I keep trying to do some other ones. I joke around about keeping the plates under my bed pillow so that they can seep up and affect me, but it's only half a joke. As I enter into this, I would like to present apologia. First of all, I'd like to apologize to non-Christians, as the alchemy plates, as Jung saw them, grew out of the collective consciousness of Christianity. He saw it as a collective compensation to what was going on in Christianity. A quick way that I think of this is in traditional Christianity, we've got this image of spirit and matter is kind of dead and void of spirit and the 2 worlds, and it took a coming down, the Son of God, to redeem matter, and then there's a returning to the spirit world. The conceit in alchemy, and drawn much more from the Gnostic tradition, is really a reverse of this. And this is why Jung was really drawn to it, because he saw the roots of his analytical psychology in this. In this Gnostic tradition, the spirit, the original spirit man, the anthropos, is actually found in matter and fragmented. And the role of the human being is to extract spirit from kind of dead matter, from negative experience, align it with the spiritual system out here to organize it, and bring it back into the world in a kind of lived spiritual philosophy. So that's to keep in mind, kind of it's Christian, but we'll be talking about that it's kind of a inside out. Then I'd like to apologize to Christians because we're going to be talking about the Christ story, but from a mythopoetic and alchemical viewpoint, as an allegory of the individuation process and the role of the self. And finally, I'd like to make an apology for gender neutrality. That again, we're going to see images, male and female, the king and the queen. But what we're talking about here, and in no way sort of supporting heterosexuality as primary in that, but really trying to stay with energies, solar and lunar energies, and try to get out of the gender elements of masculine and feminine. With that, I would like to start with a kind of well-known Jungian dictum some of you might be aware of, the idea that the soul chooses the particular life that it decides to be born into. Again, this way of Jungian psychology kind of turning things inside out. So many people come into analysis and they begin to talk about, oh, if I only had the parents and family that I think I should have had, then I could have really developed my talents. I could have been a contender. But, you know, sadly, they were saddled with these parents. This Jungian perspective, it's actually a myth by Plotinus, is the idea that the soul chose this particular path, and that is the path of individuation. So this is from Hillman and the Soul's Code. Each person bears a uniqueness that has to be lived and that is already present before it can be lived. We elected the body, the parents, the place, and the circumstances that suited the soul, and that, as the myth says, belong to its necessity. I do not understand this because I have forgotten it. Going to present this alchemical series and suggest a way, in my view, of this series that maybe we could remember that and begin to take ownership of our life. So as we enter, it is the Rosarium Philosophorum, the rosary of the philosophers. Being a fanboy, growing up, graphic novels, comic books, Marvel, I tend to approach the series as I would the panels of a comic book, and begin to follow. So I'm used to following that pictorial imagery around that. And this is the view that I've taken is like the two images here is one of the rose garden, which is the garden, the seat of attraction and love, the rose being that image. But also what I began to study and look into was that it's an allusion to the Christian rosary. And when I first began lecturing on this series, I just said, oh, and they made this allusion and compared it to the Christian rosary. But as I studied the rosary and certain life events came along, really deepened that I think the alchemists were trying to get at something deeper. And besides the rose gardens, so the rosary, as I began this research, was using an icon, a visual, and imaginative elements to portray a scenario on which to focus our attention. It's judged to be of great help in directing the imagination and mind towards a particular episode in the life of our Lord. Here we would kind of say in terms of the center of the personality for analytical psychology, the self. The rosary, Pope John Paul II said the rosary is genuine training in holiness in the school of Mary. She teaches by obtaining for us the gifts of the Holy Spirit. We'll kind of see this role of the Spirit in these series. And she trains us and molds us until Christ is fully formed in us. Jungians would say until we have a connection, an ego-self axis, a connection to the center and ordering principle of the psyche. We're going to return to this image of the rosary later. But here is the series for those of you not familiar with it. Is courtesy of Adam McLean from the Alchemy website. He's the one that colored these images and provided permission to use these images. So we begin to see the series here. These first three are considered the entry, prima materia, the starting point, and then the process start here into a dying scene. And this is what I call the mourning process that's leading to the creation of this hermaphrodite. So we're going to focus more closely on this plate, the conjunctio, plate 5 and plate 10, the hermaphrodite, and I'll kind of just quickly be passing through the other ones. Interested people should look at my other work on the Rosarium Revisited. It's the sequence Jung used to describe the psychology of the transference. So his fundamental insight was that what he saw, what's trying to happen in analytical psychology and through analysis, is this provided the template and for the individuation process. I'd just like to mention one very famous motif in alchemy. It's called the axiom of Maria as we come into this. And it's this simple saying of from the one comes the two, from the two comes the three, from the three comes the one as the fourth. It's a common motif in alchemy, and we'll kind of see as we enter the fountain here how that imagery occurs. But to take a little closer look at our series.
Oh, they are one person, they are two alone, they are three together, they are four for each other. Stand by the stairway, you'll see something certain to tell you. Confusion has its cost. Love isn't lying, it's loose in a lady who lingers, saying she is lost and choking on hello. They are one person, they are two alone, they are three together, they are four for each other.
Thank you, Ken Burns, for your inspiration, and those famous alchemists, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Jung, Helplessly Hoping. A very fitting song for the series, as we'll see. Here is the first plate. Would like you to engage it with your imagination, and would like you to look at it and get into it so deeply that you could almost imagine that you could see the clouds rotating around the fountain and activate your imagination. This is the way the plate should be approached. Through the imagination, see what it's opening up. Nobody really knew what the alchemists were talking about in particular plates. And so they provide kind of a psychological Rorschach for the images and symbols of transformation. This is the starting point. It's considered the prima materia, but it's also called the ultima materia. It's the beginning point. It's also the end point. That's the kind of crazy logic of alchemy, where something can be the image of the start and the completed. The idea always being that it's in raw form in the beginning and that it becomes organized throughout life and working through the processes. So just filled with arcane imagery, but some of the things, going back to our axiom of Maria, the oneness is together in the fountain here. The two-ness conveyed here by the great opposite Sol and Luna, which we'll be talking about, and also Mercurius duplex. In Jung's paper, he says Mercurius duplex is actually the image of the unconscious. What we are saying here again in that kind of alchemical logic is you can't say anything without its opposite also being true, that the unconscious contains all of these opposites. The threeness is portrayed in these three spigots of the fountain here and the three legs of the fountain. But the important part that we want to look at here is these three parts of the fountain. The one is called the Virgin's Milk. This is the feminine, receptive, lunar forces connected with the body. Here, virgin meaning not necessarily uninitiated sexually, but free of any contamination of kind of masculine energies. And that's the receptive, nurturing quality. The other one is the spring of vinegar, the acidic, penetrating forces. These are the solar forces. These are important energies, usually related to the spirit. And this one here is the aqua vitae, in terms of the liquid soul energies, often thought as the soul connecting the body with the spirit through what's called the mundus imaginalis, the world of the imagination. And through this, The clouds are referring to an ancient myth that the 4 elements, which are portrayed in the corners. But I also like to think of these clouds as a mystical text at the same time of the Rosarium called the Cloud of the Knowing. And the underlying message here was that the way to know God, to have this numinous experience, is to abandon all consideration of God's particular activities and be courageous enough to surrender one's mind and ego to the realm of unknowing, at which point one may begin to glimpse the nature of God or the center. The 2 clouds discussed in the book is the cloud of unknowing and the cloud of forgetting, that we forget again, just like our dictum in the part, that we actually knew something about this in the center, and then we lost that knowing, and how then again do we find it? There is a 5th star here portrayed that just want to talk about what that element is related to. And here we see these are the images of the elements. You may know this from the Da Vinci Code, that this was the masculine fire element, pointed, phallic. This was the feminine, related to the female pubis. And then you put them all together, you have a very powerful symbol, this 6-sided star. It was called the Seal of Solomon. Today, it's kind of lost some of that numinous quality as we know it as a star related to Israel. But keep in mind that 6-sided star because we see it here, and we enter into the world, the great division of the 2 opposites, Sol and Luna. We have the king sitting on Sol, Luna in terms of the connection. This is going to be a relationship. As we say, the graphic relationship is what Jung saw in this particular series. And so these opposites are drawn together. This is going to be a relationship of the import. This is going to be a relationship that changes your life. This is the one that comes together. And so there is a star sort of residing over it, kind of, directing and controlling it. We have the manifestation of this dove. Very interesting. This symbolism is carried by 2 images. It's the dove of Aphrodite, again, attraction, our rose element, but it's also the Holy Spirit that leads to an annunciation that comes down and says a great task is going to be undertaken. So this attraction, being drawn to something, is going to lead one down a path that one didn't expected. We have this interesting communication system. I would say 3 branches and these 5 flowers kind of brought in by the dove. I would just focus on, they're related to the elements, but that there's an element of duplicity in this original meeting of the opposites of these 2 people. You could think of it as a relationship, certainly in the outer world. Jung is thinking of the relationship in the analyst and the patient. But notice this part here, that there is this sinister, he says, left-handed contact. The idea in terms that the unconscious and this larger sort of path is going to have its way, not what the ego thinks this is going to be and what you were attracted to. This is really going to draw you into something deeper. And it's this unconscious path. It's one of the things I joke around and kind of say why Match.com really doesn't work, right? Because it's all ego activity. Oh, yes, I like hiking and swimming and active man, but the unconscious contact is what your shadow wants. So I think the Jungian should start shadowmatch.com. We can't promise you a relationship out of this, but you'll get maximum individuation by trying to relate to this other person. This next movement, so we'll be moving through these kind of fairly quickly. You see the change. Now they've lost the clothes, much more direct. We've lost the star, 6-sided star. Our connection through love and the Holy Spirit, Annunciation is there. But look, now we've lost the duplicity. We have the six-sidedness in the communication system, and these are the roses, right? These are the manifestation of this attraction. I kind of think of like the difference in Annie Hall, if you've ever seen that. You know, you have the two characters relating, oh, that's a really nice outfit. And then at the bottom of the screen, you have what they're really thinking and their reveries and what that boy, I can't wait to jump her bones, or, you know, in terms of what is really going on. There's more directness beginning to emerge into the relationship. This next movement is a real deepening. Jung really thought about it. Almost all the work that I've written on belongs to this place in terms of the bath. What has happened now, our six-sided star has moved into more six-sided communication, and the bath is actually six-sided. So that the vessel container itself in analysis actually becomes part of the communication. We expect whatever the dynamics are that have kind of been caught, the person has been caught in, are going to be recreated in our relationship and in a deepening relationship in the world, right? Then the shadow starts coming and we see there is a unconscious connection here. And this is the work I've done on that in terms of this diagram is what Jung came out with in the psychology of the transference. And here the consciousness, and we're being affected through the unconscious of the other person, the direct consciousness, but the two unconsciouses is making a new third. You can't say any longer who started what. So in like therapy, we say every transference is a counter transference. What, you know, you're bringing in, we used to think, oh, the patient is sort of doing that. And now the patient is doing that in reaction to the way that we're acting, and we're providing the hook, and we can't say who started what anymore. This field has been described as lunar in nature, that it's not really direct. It's not like a direct conscious connection because the unconscious is going to be brought into it. The interpersonal field of relationship often takes on a dreamlike quality, ebbing and flowing, proceeding by association rather than rational thought, playful with metaphor, open to the unconscious and its emergent phenomena. So this quality of almost dreamlike, and in analysis, we learn a split kind of consciousness, paying attention to the person, but also paying attention to what's going on in our body, what's coming up in our mind, and that is related in informing us of what's going on at the unconscious level of the relationship. This is the conjunctio. Interesting, right? Sexual in nature, right? I think it was Whitehead that kind of said alchemy was the last science that had an erotic sensibility. How often would we think of the science or chemistry being related to two people having intercourse, coitus? This is the physical level. It's more related in the earth. We see it connected with the water, but we have Sol and Luna here. And the fundamental insight that alchemy brings is what at the lowest, at the biological level, is also a reflection of the highest. That this conjunctio shows the drawing together, the conjunction of the opposites, the great bringing together the goal of wholeness, the goal of the individuation process. This is very important. This is in analysis. This is interpenetrating. Analyst says something, patient, oh my goodness, yes, that's great. I think of this. It's like good sex. It's like, you know, you're right there. You're picking up what your partner is trying to discuss and what they're needing. If you've ever seen the movie Eyes Wide Shut, there's a portrayal. A lot of people think, oh, it's just kind of orgy scene, but it's actually a portrayal of this unio mystica, the use of sexuality to kind of connect with a higher order around this. This third thing, now we can see it's being created, that there's such a closeness between these opposites, a new third thing is coming in. And I've written about this extensively, but today I'd like to focus on a different aspect of the conjunctio. Very first line of Jung's Mysterium, the factors which come together in the conjunctio are conceived of as opposites, either confronting one another in enmity or attracting one another in love. Rosarium decidedly is about the love. It's about the attraction of the opposites. But the conjunctio is very powerful to think of negative conjunctios, if just as Dana was talking about the coming together, right? We're in a major one with Russia and the Ukraine of this. And this image of the conjunctio, I'd like you to sit with this one for a bit, is what we call the gruesome conjunctio. Much different, right, than the playful coming together of the opposites. Here we have the serpent, snake entwining the woman, the feminine in a grave, in a tomb, and we see the desolation, kind of, we can almost see sort of what's happening in the Ukraine, right, sort of the bombed out areas and what's going on. This is what I would like to focus on as a part of the conjunctio. Very powerful. We don't think of them as actually coming together, but negative conjunctios are often much more powerful than even conjunctios of attraction because they're deadly. And this led Jung to kind of say the opposite of love is not hate. Hate is just love grown angry. The opposite of love is power. And I think this is an image of kind of the power dynamic. I consider it the emblem of all victims and perpetrators, persecutors. It's the systemic abuse of solar power over the weaker and more vulnerable lunar energies. We could think of it in terms of that. You think of these images as inner images of outer situations, right? We're going to see the archetypal roots of this serpent in 2 weeks with our presentation. But this is a subjugated sadomasochistic form of the third. A new thing is being created, but it's in all of this negativity. Talked about it originally, familiar with this victim psychology. This trauma becomes an inner situation, as all the people presenting for analysis usually have traumas. And it gets internalized, the trauma, as a beautiful wording from Fairburn, one of the object relations theorists, called the internal saboteur. That persecuting energy becomes attacking, and you have to deal with it as the inner situation because it would suppress and attack all the vulnerable, weaker elements of the psyche. Don Kelshed's work on trauma, childhood trauma, soul in trauma, he calls it the persecutor protector. He adds this archetypal dimension to it, protector. We don't, how is the persecutor protector? Because it keeps the person chained in this inner world to prevent change from occurring and further trauma. That the goal is to actually prevent further trauma. I think of it as like the emblem that was probably over the doorways of like Harvey Weinstein and Matt Lauer, people that had their offices and they were used to abuse the women in that, and should have been the abandon all hope, all she who enters here. We might also think, of course, it's got to come to mind the Ukrainian situation, symbolized as the inner image, as the Ukraine and its people are being subdued or tempted, controlled, and killed by the Russian forces, the acidic, penetrating, and destructive, the flood of vinegar, as we begin to witness before our very eyes on our TVs. Now, I've worked with both victims and perpetrators, and I might remind you that we sometimes forget the perpetrators do not get away unscathed. In terms of that, we somehow think of them as these other personalities. Jung talks about compulsion being the great mystery of the human psyche, right? This power to have to do something, to have it, this drive. Whether it's from Putin, whether it's from Harvey Weinstein, to get what you want. But when you combine power and privilege with compulsion, you have the recipe for disaster. The lunar forces and perpetrators have been severely damaged, sometimes irreparably, resulting in an inability to have intimate relations. And depending on how long they've been practicing the abuse, their inability to even break free, and it becomes natural. I've worked with therapists and analysts who have broken the boundaries, had sexual relations with patients. I've worked with Vietnam veterans who did atrocities, who found parts of themselves that they couldn't even realize that they could do. And impulse control becomes more and more impaired, with a greater likelihood of acting out, an extreme form of repetition compulsion in the perpetrator. This is the dynamic that installs itself in a systemic matter. And the system then somehow supports and allows it to occur for the fear of changing it. We would say, if we look at these two great opposites, right, if we think of the solar as really being the unchanging image of purpose, permanence, it doesn't want to let go, and the lunar being total changeability, impermanence. One of the reasons I think Buddhism is on the rise, because it really talks about the importance of impermanence around this, and that we're in this time of radical change, and the solar forces are sort of fighting back because they don't want things to change. We know the dynamic of the abused becoming the abuser. And sometimes it's one's own body that begins to be experienced as the persecutor. We've dealt with, particularly in hypnotherapy, working at a clinic, childhood diabetes, colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, Lyme disease, that one's own body feels like you're at a civil war, autoimmune diseases where it's turned on itself. So this is the particular image, and then we enter into the morning sequence. This is the mortificatio, of course, following trauma, following this kind of experience. It is a dying process. Like all the libido, all the energy begins to dissipate. There could be the depressions. If we're talking about the conjunctio and attraction, it's like that can't remain totally at this level, this peak experience, right? There's going to be the shadow entering in the scenes, other things beginning to dissipate, and then you start trying to recreate that first experience. But that first experience came because it was natural, because it entered, and then all of a sudden the ego gets a hold of it and tries to do that. Martha Stark has a beautiful article called Relentless Hope. The idea that you could find this perfect thirdness is what I call it. The person who's going to be that exact fit and matching for you, and it's who is basically going to heal those wounds of the trauma. This is what Jung says around this plate. starts talking about death, and I'm talking about the aftermath of trauma, right? This is sort of when there is the shock. Says nobody who finds himself on the road to wholeness can escape that characteristic suspension, which is the meaning of crucifixion. Notice that image that he brings in here. For he will infallibly run into things that thwart and cross him. And he says, these things tend to be the thing he has no wish to be, the realization of the shadow. The Vietnam veteran that I worked with who participated in the My Lai massacre and who ended up raping women and killing children. He had no idea that he was capable of this, but in that fog of war, in this mad parts of madness coming out, that all of a sudden he found an aspect of himself that he never really wanted to know. I think of Terence's poem, nothing of a human being is beyond me, that we're all capable of this. If any one of us can do it, any of us can do it in terms of the capacity for that. So that awareness of shadow is a dying process, right? Parts of ourselves we don't want to know. The thing that is not, the other, the individual, the reality of the you. When Jung kind of did this paper on the psychology of the transference, and he came out with these alchemy plates, people thought he was crazy, thought you were going to talk about, you know, the transference, and you're talking about these esoteric alchemy plates. But in this, he saw the template for the movement and the individuation process, made the clearest statement, you can't individuate without the other. You can't individuate on the mountaintop contemplating your navel, because you'll never see your blind spots. You have to have an other who illuminates the parts that you actually don't want to see in yourself. And the psychic non-ego, the collective unconscious, Jung's famous statement here is that an experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Something larger. We think we're in control, we're captain of the ship, and we realize no, the ocean and the natural forces that are about us are really much more in control. At best, we can sort of hang on, we could align ourselves with this. We can do it kicking and screaming, or you can live much more in harmony with this. This next plate, and we see this is a different plate sort of from the dying process. One of my colleagues, Nathan Schwartz-Salant, and I had this dialogue. He was looking at some of my work. He says, you don't differentiate between these two plates. Really begin to see that plate of mortificatio. The dying is like the original loss, the shock, like right after trauma. And then this is really the sequelae, we call it the loss of soul. The soul, we see that the two people are beginning to be joined together in this tragic kind of, you know, element, in the sadness. If your partner is really unhappy in the outer world, you are unhappy around that. If a person in analysis is struggling, you are struggling kind of with that, because you have to go to that place in yourself to be able to speak to them. So we have this image of this called the soul bird. Let me just give you a little close up on this. So this image, notice it's portrayed as masculine. It's a little homunculus, we say, a miniature version. So what's being hinted at here, there's a second series, and this image is portrayed as feminine. But this one is the solar energies are having to go, the clouds represent spirit world. And for Jungians, the spirit is represented by basically archetypal ideas and sort of superego qualities. Maybe it's a religion around this, but a piece of yourself, and the two people is searching to make some sense of what just happened, either the loss of the good or the terrible negative aspect of the trauma, and how was this drawn into your life. We have the idea that collective movements have these archetypal cores, right? That's what constellates. I was thinking when we first did the presentation, right, we were talking about what was going on in the world and the gender issues and what was happening with all of the sexual abuse that was coming out. And we had the reaction of the Me Too movement and feminism, that these could be considered some of these core sort of spiritual ideas that begin sort of pounding that that solar masculine, kind of tempering it. So we have like the courts, then bringing people in for punishment. One of the things I was thinking about of what's changing if we think about this in the Ukrainian situation, that what is this solar quality that we kind of see the attack on these people, right? Well, the lunar quality that I see that's really happening that maybe hasn't happened in any war was we're getting to see it at the ground level. We're seeing it on people's cell phones. We're with the people in the bunkers. We're with the people. See the one image where the guy is turns around to get some water for the person, and a bomb hits a family and they're totally obliterated. We get to witness it in an experience near place. So that in wars before, even in the Iraq war, I was struck by, they always talked about from a distance. We just saw the smart missiles honing in on objects. We didn't see the people actually being killed. So we have this lunar quality of a really feeling level and identifying with it. And of course, the major thing and the surprise of the world is the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Like, were they going to fold? Was it going to be like Afghanistan? They were just going to give themselves over? But no, the spirit of the people and connected to their country. How many of the people that they're attacking are major cities in Chicago and San Francisco and New York would rally around and kind of, fight for this thing. So these are some of the ways that I think that this is beginning to change. This solar, acidic, penetrating, dissolving quality that is kind of coming now is meeting different types of energies around it. And in 2 weeks, our other part, we're going to see our Adam, from the Adam and Eve, undergoing such an educative process in relationship to the feminine. Here's the next movement. This is one interesting part of the plates. It's called the mundificatio, in terms of a moistening process. So our soul has disappeared. There's a union of the soul and spirit in here, and this leads to the rain that begins moistening this desiccated corpse here. I think it's interesting what's being hinted at is like the feeling level, the affectivity has to change before an idea or meaning from the experience can be drawn. That what a really primal, I would encourage all of you to kind of think of this in your own experience. Is there actually a kind of shift in feeling tone before that? We like to think of, oh, we found some meaningful experience. Usually people come into therapy and they said, well, this is just, terrible. I wonder what it means, what its purpose. It's like, no, you don't look for meaning kind of at that point in the mortificatio, right? You have to just hold the experience and stay with the feelings and the pain of it. And then there might be a change of feeling that then allows the meaning to occur. In this next part here, we have the return of the soul. We see our little soul bird kind of returning from the University of the Archetypes. I like to think of that, got a diploma, learned something, aligned all that feeling, the negative, got some part, aligned with the spiritual system. Maybe it's a religious system, maybe it's analytical psychology, maybe it's the tarot, maybe it's the I Ching, maybe it's a work of art that begins to speak to the person. Something begins to return to the desiccated corpse here and look at, and we see the water appearing here. But what's appearing here is what's called the fledged and the unfledged birds. It's really thought to be an image of redemption, of something beginning to emerge anew from the ground. Two-ness often entails new consciousness, because you need two things to become conscious. To have black, you have to have white. It's opposite, it actually gives it the definition. But a personal reference for me, and in dealing with people and in my own experience, I like to think of this one as never really making it kind of into the world, that alchemically, this is what we might think of or talk about as dross, the part of an experience that actually never changes. I worked with one woman who had these third-degree burns, and if you know anything about the burns, they have to go through a debridement process, like over 3/4 of her body, where they actually put her in a tank, and the burn kind of crystallizes, and then it has to be torn from the body. And she says to me, "I should not have lived." And at first I thought she was kind of saying in this way, "Oh, you know that, but she made it through." And she's going, "No, no, no, you don't understand. I wished I didn't live, because that was so horrific. Even the memory of it is terrifying." And this is the part that I generally see, that people may have gone through traumatic experience or the loss of things, but they sort of, there's always the ego side that wishes it could have happened some other way, that you could have gotten this learning of this part of the soul sort of, you know, going into the archetypal realm. And so, but it's now emerging. We're putting this sort of soul spirit combination back into the body. And this is the outcome of it. It's called the rebus, the hermaphrodite. It's the new birth. It's a new third. And we said it started with the conjunctio, that there was a thirdness, but there was still separateness in this. And you see, this is kind of an amalgam that's being created here, because it is the hermaphrodite. And what we see is the wings. So we know it's undergone a spiritualized process. The wings tell us that it has become spiritual. We see our numbers from the axiom, the 3 and the 1, the tension of these. Jung always used to like to talk about this and think about this in terms of typology, that you could have 3 of the functions sort of in consciousness, but the inferior function, the one that's closest to the unconscious, which is the God connection, which is the self connection, is the damnedest thing to bring in. I think of, like, you could have the 3 functions in terms of like tennis balls, you know, and you learn to juggle them, but then you bring in the inferior function and it's like a bowling ball. Somebody throws a bowling ball in there, and not only are you trying to get the rhythm of it, but this thing carries a whole different weight to it, and trying to integrate it into consciousness, kind of the goal of a lifetime. But it brings in this quality of the numinous, you know, being an introverted feeling type. When I bought the first house, could not afford any repairs. I am not a carpenter, and I will never be one, but I tried to rehab this house, open up this doorway to a bedroom and open it up into a study. had to learn all about headers and wiring and electrical and cutting through all of this part took me 3 times as long as I thought, 5 times the amount of money. And then it was a chapel. I took tours. I took people through tours to show them this opening, because this inferior sensate function and being able to do this, I thought was a grand achievement, and it actually had this numinosity. It's actually called the Empress or the White Stone. This idea here really wants you to think of, we've got our raven here, which a lot of theorists saying, what is that doing here? Well, it's not really the end of the series. It's the only end of the series as Jung talked about it. And the black raven always heralds a Negredo. There's going to be something else happening. It sort of comes from the myth of Apollo and Coronis, where punishes the raven for the bad news. Ravens were white and then they become black. And then we have this lunar tree, the moon tree, which is a reference to it has become vegetative, a grounded way of living. But it is this lunar quality that always particularly struck me. When I was sort of younger, and I first looked at the plates and understanding it, I was saying, oh, this lunar quality is like an observing ego. It sort of like brings in this quality of distance coming right into psychology from the Vietnam era. I saw officers who acted in this manner. It didn't matter if somebody screwed up. You weren't there and blaming the soldier. That did nothing. You just had to deal with the situation of what was going on. That was my model. Oh, it's objective in this way. It's when I was young and full of piss and the stream of vinegar. It was like, yeah, well, I thought I had it, but it was a clinical approach and people started reacting. I don't like to be treated distantly and clinically. And then as I learned how to be a better analyst and started reading people like Winnicott and his writings, then I started softening that approach, right? Not objectivity with its hard edges. But it started beginning to be ideas like good enough holding. Like, what does the person feel like they're responded to, feeling like they're heard, feeling like they're seen? And then I started using the image of like analytic mindfulness, because that was in the collective consciousness. Mindfulness sort of, took over the collectivity, and that word started getting it. And the topic of this particular presentation was actually that I've moved to what I call compassionate witnessing, that I got onto in terms of as I deepened into the rosary and as a particularly changing life experience happened to me. And so if we return now to our image of the rosary, to talk about, so we've got this idea here and the focus. Remember that idea of Jung saying it's a crucifixion, it's a thing that you get crossed by. So in Christianity, right, the role of Mary as the mother, she's the Grail who suffers along with her son, who gives birth to him, who brings him into life, and particularly in the Passion, she's the one that follows him. Alchemically, then I began to realize, oh, virgin's milk. No, we're talking about the virgin's milk, not just a virgin's milk, that the alchemists might have been referring to this virgin's milk, this nurturing substance, this lunar quality was actually something related to Mary, and why they call this series the Rosary of the Philosophers, and that nourishes Mercurius as he suffers in matter. And then the analytical psychology, right? We sort of psychologize it. It's an image of the empathic container, the holding place, which allows the ego to individuate through the trauma, through the experience, to have a different experience, to be shared and witnessed by somebody. And then finally, and bringing it into a much more emotional experience, the witnessing of one's own trauma, whether as victim or as perpetrator, that we can also, particularly people that have been abused, can actually turn around, right? As we said, the abused becomes the abuser. So I put together, I found, I used to joke around and say, found some archival footage from the crucifixion, from the Passion of Christ, from ARIS, the Archives of Research and Archetypal Symbolism, and that we happen to find it, and you'll see it, all kind of stutters and not very good version. But to be honest with you, it's actually from Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ. I took out all the scenes. It was never talked about. It was a very controversial movie. And because of the violence, and a lot of people felt the anti-Semitism that was going on, but nobody I found really talked about this role of Mary in it. It was just kind of happening on the side. So I put together a little montage of Mary's role in the Passion here that I think is actually connected with, again, why the alchemists were actually trying to compare this part, this individuation process, this role with the rosary. So again, be aware there's violence for people that might not want to turn away from that. What I would ask you to really look at some particular parts and focus on this. Particularly, there's a beginning, an identified beginning. And Mary kind of says it happens, you know, this is the beginning of the trauma. This is when the weird uncle shows up at your bedroom door. This is when the car comes out of nowhere and crashes into the side of you. This is when you get a cancer diagnosis. And everything begins to change. That's the moment, the beginning. And I want you to look at this role of the Passion, not as this Christian story, but as trauma is being played out. That Christ here is an image of the victim ego, the centurions, an image of the persecutors in terms of torturing that lunar substance, that part that is not going to fight back. And I want you to be aware of Mary's role in the gaze, that she continues watching it in terms of tracking Jesus. She runs through the streets. She has to catch his eyes because only that allows him to complete his task. There's one beautiful part in here. These filmmakers, don't know where they got it from, but she's unable to do it. And she has a reverie of Jesus being a small boy and falling down. And she runs to him and able to hold him, what she cannot do in this situation. But then she, in the reverie, and the function of that reverie allows her to kind of come there, catch his eyes again, and complete the task. And then that there's an ending with this now famous PH image. So if you can sit back and just watch this, it's pretty powerful.
Seri Adonai. Amin.
ليلى انت امي امي
امي كلها خرج.
من جسمي لبعض من لبابي بريء امثمك
رو وباكي
And final image is at the Pieta, right? Meaning pity or compassion, from which I drew the name in terms of what maybe the alchemists were seeking by alluding to that this series in the Rosary, and we're trying to develop a type of Mary consciousness here, replacing our hermaphrodites standing on that lunar surface, befriending that snake element, having a relationship to it around that. This is the genuine training in holiness in that school of Mary, that we're all trying to learn that Mary gaze to make sense, to hold our own trauma. I found this quote in actually the dogma of the Trinity. The wisdom of the Father lies in the lap of the Mother. The wisdom of the Father, not the power of the Father, right? If we can only get Putin into the lap of the lunar, right, qualities, it's that tempering of those solar qualities. So finally, it's like, how do we move beyond what was done to you and what you yourself have done? You know, what does the Rosarium, if we understand it this way, what is this progression? And without this type of awareness, victims and perpetrators are forever locked into the blame and shame cycle, leading to anger and rage that always remains reactive and retaliatory until the isness of the event is somehow accepted and lived through, right? In terms of this trauma. I think this only happens when one can surrender. Emmanuel Gent of the Relational School has a beautiful paper on the role of surrender, not the usual shapes of it of submission and sadistic or masochism, but truly giving a self one's over to this dreadful fact of existence, this trauma of inner and outer. And I would suggest finally, and end with the note, that at this moment, we're able to reach that moment of surrender, is that's when we remember that our soul actually chose this and no other life. We come to a point of acceptance where we can actually have a sense of our own responses that we may need to make in life instead of being caught in endless repetition compulsions. Thank you.
Well, Gus, that was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you very much for what an in-depth presentation. I was struck by any number of the images that reminded me of the Splendor Solis. And I'm wondering, Dyane, if you would engage Gus about there was one where the male figure was standing on the sun and the female figure is standing on the moon, and then there was another where they're both standing on the moon. And it seems to me that these are themes that resonate with perhaps the study of alchemy in general. And this is just two examples of both those particular approaches tapping into an archetypal base.
Oh, well, I'm honored. I never heard that before, but anytime I'm honored to be thought of like that. And I'm still so moved by your whole talk and how it felt as if everything you said fit perfectly, was there in this kind of perfect way in how you talked about these images that are so familiar to me, and yet brought, without, you didn't get into a kind of solar power complex that people sometimes get into when they lecture. Could feel your compassion through your whole lecture. and that you were embodying what you were talking about, Gus, and just found that so moving, that you show us it is possible to do this work. And I feel so moved by that. I like what Dana said about the archetypal base of this. And I can remember, it brought to my mind my own experience of at a certain moment in my life where I had gratitude for everything I had suffered, that I could not be myself if I hadn't suffered those things.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of conscious suffering, not turning away. And you know, Gus, there's this in the Splendor Solace, there's that wonderful image of the white bird in the vessel that you know well, watching soldiers on horses and wearing armor, attacking peasants. And I sent out a thing about it this week because it reminds me so much of what's going on. But that poor, remember Mary Jo Spencer in San Francisco saying, that poor bird, it's standing there with its little feet on this glass and has the heads looking out at everything that's going on and can do nothing, looking through this darkened glass. But it has a body that's heart-shaped. So it has that element of the compassion and witnessing, but not reacting, that I think you talk about as central. And it felt like that's one of the many places where these two alchemical works really come together.
Yes, I think, thank you, Dyane. That's what I've seen in some of your work, and and really helping. I know Carolyn and I have talked about that, distinguishing, separating out, the patriarchal and not necessarily the solar energies. It's like to get a hold of that. They're not identical.
No.
Around that. I think, you're also grasping some of that. There is a place we do need those energies. That's really what I think the second series is about, is like with the feminine, the female soul bird, is like if there was a softening of the solar energies in the second series, I think there's a toughening of the lunar energies. I see it as in preparation for death.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what kind of death?
When I talk about actually the literal death, I know a lot of people talk about the second series of going through another transformation of solar consciousness. Nathan Schwartz Salon talks about it that way, but I see in the second series, like, okay, if we can develop this type of consciousness, now we deal with all the slings and arrows. I call it analyzed by life, right? All the declines with aging, all the losses, all the really catastrophes, and how we begin to navigate that in that series of like the green lion swallowing the solar energies itself, taking it in.
When you're talking about second series, I just want to clarify. I think you're talking about the remaining images of the Rosarium, the ones that Jung didn't address.
Didn't use.
Gus, I've always wondered whether that was as far as Jung could get.
Yeah, I was wondering that too. Like he had derogatory things. He said, yeah, second series, it's like a reworking of the feminine. I always thought of him as like, well, here's a guy that never met an alchemical plate that he didn't love, All of a sudden he sort of tosses out this second series. And I think it was all caught up. He dedicates the Rosarium to Emma, his wife. I think he was working out the relationship to Tony at the time. He makes this one error in there of showing the conjunctios from the second with the first, like it's a spiritualized thing. But, you know, he was actually having sex with Tony, not just a spiritual relationship. So I think that's what is part of what was confounding and why he couldn't quite grasp the second series.
Interesting.
Gus, I want to thank you for this presentation. It's so very different than the experience in wherever that city was, Minneapolis, where we first presented. There was more time to go into more. When your comments about no perpetrator escapes unscathed reminds me of Monica Lucci's book, Torture, Psychoanalysis, and Human Rights, which is a remarkable book. The image of Mary, not of Mary, but the torturers taking pleasure. Yeah, the centurions taking such pleasure is so chilling. And so I think what I'm taking away from this presentation is how this alchemical insistence informs trauma work, because there is something that separates out in trauma itself that gets orphaned from consciousness and has to be brought home. And some part of soul, I have to believe, is captured by that trauma and has to be brought home from being in an orphaned state, brought back into consciousness. And in that, that's where the Vietnam veteran has to meet, or that's where the centurion in any of us has to meet, where we have felt the schadenfreude or the pleasure of the crimes we commit against ourselves or others. Thank you. Thank you, Gus.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's great. Maybe it's that part too that you're talking about in the vessel, Dyane. You know, the dove, the spirit does eventually have to be reunited.
So Gus, I was picking up with particular interest on Maria, the prophetessa, and her recipe.
Yes, you would. That's the kind of girl you are.
So I had a dream of a woman peering through a door at a very pregnant woman tending to a sort of cauldron-like vessel at a hearth, without having yet seen Michael Myers' plate of that same woman. And I started thinking about Maria's recipe and the statements that she would make about the divine in nature, the delicate operation, precious nature contained internally, and how she might have used that as a woman experience of the body and the pregnant body as a dual container, or moreover, a double container, not a dual, a double container. So thinking about the bain-marie, because she was also very—
That's what I was thinking of as you were talking. Yeah.
So the bain-marie is one container immersed into another container. And that first container is immersed in water, which is being heated within the container that's making contact with fire.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the different processes of the elements, fire and water, and I started thinking about that internal process, that the substance that's within that first container being held by the containing maternal waters, where there's sort of a protective element. So in thinking about trauma, and volatile substances, the fire can be too hot. And so what we can be called to is a more gentle containing of the psychological life of that person who has suffered that kind of trauma.
That's great, Susan. Yeah, it's like a buffer, and it to stay out of the direct heat, right? Still have to deal with the heat, but there's a tempering, right, of that sharpness, that penetrating of the fire for the transformation, right, to occur.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's too intense, right? You get burnt, scalded food.
You know, Gus, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about this. You know, normally I've been working on some stuff lately around shadow disrupting ego, right? You know, so that luminescent, you know, shining forth of the ego being disrupted by shadow is kind of the inversion of what you're talking about with that kind of solar acid impending or imposing on the lunar. And what I think so interesting about it is it seems to really just be an inversion of perspective. The shift in perspective from the perspective of the solar being threatened and invaded by shadow, flipped around now to the perspective of a lunar feeling the acidity and vitriol. And I think that alone is that shifting in perspective. I don't know. I just wonder how important you think that is to the successful completion of the integration of the conjunctio itself.
Oh, I think you're striking. There's something, you know, I think that's actually what analytical psychology does best, you know, in terms of it's that turnaround in perspective. Yeah, you know, just as I started the thing, oh yeah, you think you were, you know, you got this family, gee, if you had the right family, you could have been that, but if you turn that perspective around of like actually know something of you chose this particular path, and I think that's that's a great, well, in terms of the shift in perspective, it's always, it seemed like when I was first in training was like, you know, there was this turning inside out kind of, you know, quality that it had. Oh, you think this is the way and this happened and mother made this, you know, happening. No. You know, look at it from this perspective. And, you know, that I think is part of that shift, that it might, part of that perspective change might be some element that I'm suggesting of like compassionate witnessing, and might help something of that attitude.
When Susan was talking, I made a link and I wonder what you would think of it. I was thinking, linking the compulsion, trauma and compulsion with the bain-marie, that there's something about the intensity of trauma that can become compulsive, that the person seeks out that kind of intensity and tries to bring it into analytic work, into their lives, acting out, and how difficult that can make the work if you're trying to keep the trauma in the bain-marie and the person is trying to get you both to jump into the fire.
Yeah, that's great. I think, you know, it's the trauma like opens this whole, you know, one of worst situation I supervised this and didn't see was, you know, a young girl that was abused in grammar school, but the relationship with the abuser continued continuously into her 30s. And just what you were saying, there was something about it, the compulsion, you know, that it was like only this. It was the part, as painful as it was, that you could feel alive, right? Because it opened up this, you know, young ego to this experience that she's not at all prepared for. It's what a lot of people don't understand, where, you know, the repetition or going back, you know, or not being able to leave it. And I think you're, you know, getting at that, Dyane.
If I could just add to that, you know, what the water does when it's boiling is it agitates. It's agitating. So usually the container that goes into the double boiler that holds the substance is tempered. It's thick, it's strong, and it's tempered so that it can take the heat.
Yes, yeah, and built that way. That was, if you didn't get it from Susan, the Bain Marie actually came from Maria Prophecy. So she was developed a lot of this apparatus, and that was the piece that was named after her in terms of the containers.
I'm fascinated actually about the tempering of steel. And when you go back to some of the oldest stories of tempering steel, the steel baby is dipped in milk, in the milk of the mother. And you're talking about the virgin's milk. And that was, I just wanted to expand a little bit around that. I think about the milk of Romulus and Remus that, turned them into, and the milk Hera's milk that Hercules drank. This milk, the virgin milk, I think is the cosmic milk, the Milky Way milk, which is associated with newts and these goddesses. And so I think that when you have symbolically the steel character dipped in the milk as symbolic of the quenching, I think it's shifting because, just what does a steel baby have to do with drinking from a breast? But you still got to have, the ultimate super child draw from that source of creation. And so instead it becomes the milk that the baby's quenched in instead of the milk that it drinks. Anyway, I've been playing around with some of those thoughts. So thanks.
That's great amplification. Do you know the alchemical plate from Atlanta Fuegians of the mother nursing Mercurius? And in the one corner is Romulus and Remus being nursed by the wolf. And in the other corner is Zeus being nursed by the goat. That after he was saved by his mother and not swallowed by his father. And then I think it's getting at that same thing, that nurturing quality in the one realm of the Olympian spirit was in the same realm of what was going on in the earthly world.
That goat is probably comparable to the goat at the top of Yggdrasil, which gives forth the four directions of milk. But that goat is associated with the Milky Way is actually, you can see the tree of life on the Milky Way. If you look at the dogs, the snakes, the birds, you see it laid out with the birds on one side and the snakes on another. It's the tree of life, the Milky Way, not to reduce the tree of life to the Milky Way, of course, but it's one of the places where we can project it. But there it is, there's the milk in the goat. And where I think it's so interesting with the dog is that the dog, of course, we spent thousands of years with dogs before any other animals. So I think when we're looking at dog milk, we're looking at the first projection of milk onto a partner, the old stuff.
That's great. I hope all you people out there are appreciating that us geeks getting together and we're into this stuff.
Gus, are we talking about the healing potential of what I call the lunar masculine? So you have the masculine character that seemingly by nature seeks identity, seeks control. It seeks all of the things that render it powerful in a world of perception and relationship. And it's when it descends into giving way and allowing itself to feel the thing that it is being asked to submit, that the moon then becomes a really powerful symbol for the masculine in a way that it really isn't by nature programmed to do. And I don't know if I'm reading something into this, but everything seems to be about how do we heal some of this fractured woundedness? How do we overcome the thing that has defined us?
Yeah, I think that image too, Dana, is Marcus West has a beautiful paper where he did the Rosarium kind of, and that sharp pointed part. He's talking about the transformation of narcissism. which I think you were, another way that we could imagine that. But that is a conjunctio, right? Like that solar, feminine or masculine, lunar masculine, right? Those are conjunctios that I think are hinted at, imaged in these hermaphrodites. I think that's the other thing, I see this thirdness is like really coming to collective consciousness in gender now that, and particularly the young people are using gender in this way. Jung kind of said about this hermaphrodite, he said, oh, this is like a monstrous image, this combination of these things. But I think what's actually happening is that movement of non-binary, right, is actually trying to bring these energies together, don't identify this way. I think sometimes it gets too concretized or literalized, right, in that way. But what's being hinted at, I think, is this very powerful energy that are trying to find a way of coming together.
Isn't it possible that the very things that we really need to overcome is that notion of a separate self? That whether it is us as individuals through the lens of identity or gender or what have you, but to enter the life force of what can be called the Tao, where all particulars aspire to the universal condition of oneness that makes them synchronous with what is happening in reality. And when we do that, we fall into this thing called the zone. And the zone can be perpetuate, but it comes up a moment at a time and then it vanishes. And that, to me, is the patriarchal part of the human psyche that just doesn't have the skill to stay in the moment long enough to let go of its particular identities.
I think it's that energy, right? That's the battle of kind of, the white supremacy. It's like they want to keep things the way they always were, which was them having the power, right? And the lunar energies are coming in of the populations are changing. It's that shifting, it's not staying the same, and they're trying to keep it locked in, through power.
I'm so interested in this, and because I'm really curious about what's going on in our world as a big picture. And I'm just thinking, like, if we have a soul, if we have this all in us, if this is all in me, right? Then I wonder, what is my solar masculine doing to my lunar masculine, right? And I wonder if over time, what happens is a kind of drying out of my own lunar qualities, right? So I wonder if by the time that acid is eating it away, by the time it will start to break it down to change, I wonder if that might be something that when the over masculine or overly solar has gotten so much control that it has sucked the life out of something or dried it out, may it be on its path to its own self-destruction. Might what we see in these plates be a kind of a death that comes following what the solar masculine may do to our own lunar feminine inside?
Yeah. That's good. When we did this experience and the next time when Carolyn presents her part, and I was in there, we were sort of imagining it of like this compassionate witnessing and hearing kind of, the lunar and the feminine kind of qualities, but that's what it was. All the emotions I was kind of going through of like, oh my God, am I doing something wrong as a man? Just what you're talking about, that fear that it was like showing, and I should take a stand with this or something, which we wrote up in the paper. Hope that we'll get to as part of that presentation.
Well, as you said earlier, not knowing is the highest form of wisdom. I mean, the boundaries of uncertainty surround not knowing in an infinite sort of way. It's only when you prioritize some form of consciousness that you begin to set up boundaries between uncertainty, the unconscious, and what have you. what we really need to develop skills for are letting go and not having this real desire for certainty or for control. There's a wonderful little book called Lunar, written by a fellow named Howard Teich. I highly recommend this book because it really comes out in a way that it asks us to really look beyond the thing that we think we know to the thing that we don't know and be guided by, I'll call it curiosity, but it's letting go of the fixed frames of reference that put the human being at the center of consciousness. And when we begin to see these forms of consciousness in the natural world outside of space and time, suddenly, again, we go back to this condition of oneness that just transcends the moments that we're in. Now, we do have to come back to the moment. Like right now, we're in Ukraine with this Russian invasion going on, and you just have to but feel the pain of looking at this on a day-to-day basis. That's the pain of patriarchy. To me, this is raising its head up and saying, we really need to do some serious looking at what the human condition has become if in this day and age we can launch this against ourselves. I mean,
it's great. I think the two of you, you spoke for the microcosm, Will, and you just spoke for the macrocosm, the above and the below, in very elucidating ways.
Well, I think that if we can make these conversations commonplace and just have it with one another on any sort of basis, they don't have to be formalized. They can be just the way that we now are teaching ourselves to think, and just asking questions about the nature of reality and how did we get ourselves into this predicament today? What could possibly have created a legitimacy for a country so overbearing and powerful to wreak havoc on its little neighbor? And why? And what is...
I think that you're asking, well, my response to that is how are we constantly caught in the gruesome conjunctio, that powerful image, and if the plates offer something, they offer, or Gus's work with the plates of a merry consciousness. I am wondering if I could say a few words about next time, because it sort of ties in to what you're asking.
Great.
Would that be okay?
That's a perfect place for us to be at this time. Before we do that, let me ask Susan if you had any final words, because I think we can end up with Carolyn and Gus talking about what our next session is going to be. That's the companion part to this particularly wonderful afternoon.
I found a little passage. Paul from the Corinthians, I fed you with milk, not solid food. You were not ready for it.
That's great.
So my understanding.
There you go, Will.
Yeah, right. And so, addressing people as if they weren't ready for the meatier, more substantial messages of the gospel. And so what you're doing is revivifying the milk of the mother. So my only other little comment is just that we talk about ideas, but the phenomenon of this talk tonight created a field for dreams, for synchronicity, and that other more lunar way of knowing, that lunar consciousness, that way of knowing and being present to what is and what we're experiencing and what's happening in our bodies. And I just always want to make a case for bringing us back home into this marvelous container that can tolerate watching all those images, feeling all that suffering. We are a truly marvelous container.
Part of what has arisen in this container is such a lovely, natural, and organic segue into what might emerge in the next container 2 weeks from now. We are, in a way, at a meeting place where theory of archetypes meets the cultural appropriation and stereotyping of those archetypes. That's something, Dana, that I think you're speaking to. And that's also what myths do. They are conduits for archetypal expression. That we know that these myths, they filter and communicate through human experience in word and deed, and what Susan's saying, in body. So this zone, this meeting place between archetypal theory and the cultural appropriation of archetypes, is a very active zone. And I think our next time will pull for both clarity and confusion. I know that it's very important not to conflate the masculine archetype with a patriarchy and the feminine archetype with a matriarchy. It is, I think, fair to say that a patriarchy, as Dana was alluding to, for millennia has held a monopoly on some of the solar and power aspects of the masculine archetype, and has been overinformed by those aspects. So hence the call for lunar consciousness to be recognized and experienced and not oppressed in the masculine, and for solar consciousness to be recognized and experienced and not oppressed in the feminine. So at the next Myth Salon, Gus and I will present a screenplay that invites a reconciling conversation between those two archetypes. But to have a conversation, the archetypes of the masculine and the feminine have to be embodied and languaged to have a conversation. It's a conversation that will invite us to deconstruct some of the political and cultural power structures that are historically fought over by those who are invested in and benefit from a patriarchy, and by those who do not. I hope all of you will join us. I know both Gus and I are really looking forward to it.
I'm going to be there.
Oh, this is cool. I can't wait.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
All right. I would like to go out again following a stream of eloquent words, just some silence. One more time, please. And I would encourage you, if you're around on a Tuesday morning, come take a watch when Will and I meet up with Kira Rudick. It's a privileged access that we have. And, you know, we're going to try to journal throughout the entire duration of this absurd phenomenon that's going on over there. So,
and for those of you guys who don't know, I mean, it is just so special that Kira joins us. She's on CNN every other day. She's on all the news channels, and the fact that she makes some time to talk with us is very precious. And it's specifically because she wants to encourage scholarship and creativity to respond and participate.
Well, we have seen, first of all, lots of airstrikes, and the amount of them has increased. Yesterday, the airstrike and the missile hit right near the house where I'm located right now.
And front lines that are not limited to NATO's boundaries when it comes to the narrative conflict.
So, thank you all very much. What a beautiful afternoon. Gus, Carolyn, Susan, Dyane, and my partner in this, Will. You're the best. Okay,
everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
you.
Thanks, Gus.
Thank you. Bye-bye.